You have said these words 1,000 times, maybe with your eyes closed, or on your knees, or barely moving your lips between the clatter of morning. They are so familiar that their rhythm can become a lullaby, comforting, automatic. And yet, there is a place inside you that still feels the sentence stop short, as if a hand cut the prayer's thread before it returned home. What if that unease is not just your imagination? What if the prayer you were taught was once a circuit, an intentional loop of calling and return, and somewhere along the way the closing loop was loosened, edited, or redirected, so that the voice of God remained always out there, beyond you, rather than breathing through you? Tonight, I want to walk with you through a set of fragments and traditions that suggest the possibility that an ending once existed to close that circuit. I will offer a reconstruction, and I will teach a way to practice it, but none of this is meant to overturn your faith or to replace the scriptures you treasure. Think of it as a retrieval, a piece of liturgical memory rescued from the margins and held up to the light. The discovery that began this conversation was not made by an insider in a library, but by accident in the desert sand. In 1945, in the region near Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, a collection of codices, fragile books of papyrus wrapped in leather, was found. The manuscripts were not part of the canonical libraries. Many had been buried, hidden, or simply preserved by communities whose voices were later marginalized. Among them were sayings attributed to Jesus, Gnostic reflections, and alternative Christological texts. Some of these writings, like certain sayings in the Gospel of Thomas, do not present a narrative of life and death so much as a set of pointers, concise teachings meant to awaken recognition, to trigger remembrance. That discovery reopened a question scholars and practitioners had long felt but rarely named aloud. When the early church curated the library of authoritative texts, what criteria were used? We know, with historical humility, that councils and influential leaders in the 3rd and 4th centuries participated in editorial decisions, and that political, theological, and pastoral considerations played into which books were read aloud in public worship and which were relegated to private circles. Saying this is not accusing anyone of a grand theft. It is noting that any communal memory is always also an act of selecting, of curating, of shaping a tradition for a given time and set of needs. There is another strand that matters here, the desert tradition. Men and women who retreated into caves and monastic cells in the deserts of Egypt and Syria preserved a practice-oriented contemplative Christianity. Evagrius Ponticus and others wrote about prayer as an inner discipline, a purification of attention. They describe resisting distractions, cultivating interior silence, and training the body and breath to become hospitable to presence. In their notebooks, you glimpse a Christianity less centralized around institutional reading and more oriented around interior technologies, practices designed to reorient the heart toward God. Put these two strands side by side, textual fragments that preserve alternative sayings and a living tradition that treats prayer as a practice to be trained, and a picture emerges. The Lord's Prayer, in its most familiar liturgical forms, moves outward. It addresses God, petitions for provision, asks for forgiveness, and pleads for deliverance. Yet as you say it, you may also sense it bending inward if you listen carefully, as if its arc ought to return whatever it invokes back into your chest. The question that animates this exploration is simple. What would it look like if the prayer were not just a set of petitions directed outward, but a ritualized breathing of God back into you? Before we follow that thread into philology and practice, a brief pause for the practical. If what I'm describing resonates with you, stay with me until the end of this message. There will be a guided practice to center this as more than an idea. If this material feels unfamiliar or destabilizing, know that the intention here is recovery, not rupture. Keep whatever you love about your tradition. Let this be a supplement for your inner life, not a subtraction from the faith you already hold. Now let us look slowly at the prayer's architecture. I am not going to print or claim to reproduce any lost scripture exactly. Rather, I will trace the movement step by step and listen for the roots in the language Jesus likely used. Many scholars propose that Jesus taught in Aramaic or used Aramaic phrases when addressing his followers. When we look at the prayer through Aramaic ears, certain words shine with different possibilities. Take the opening. The word often translated as Father is rendered in Aramaic as Abun or Avan in its intimate form.
That term carries not only paternal resonance, but the idea of a source, a wellspring, a principle from which life and breath emerge. Abun suggests origin. It is the place from which the first motion of breath comes. If the prayer begins by locating the source, the rest of its structure can be heard as a movement that draws sustenance from that source and then, ideally, returns it in some fashion. Another key term in the Aramaic imagination is Shemaya, the plural that becomes the word we translate as heavens. But Shemaya also implies a dimension, a realm of light, of openness, a sky that is not merely outside, but a quality of reality. The ancient world did not divide spirit and matter the way later metaphysics would. When you speak of the Shemaya, you are invoking a dimension suffused with light, with presence.
The prayer calls the source not only by relation, Father, but by realm, of the Shemaya, inviting that dimension toward the one who prays. As we move through the prayer's petitions, words that in later translations hardened into categories, bread, debt, temptation, are richer in Aramaic resonance. The term commonly translated as bread, often from the Greek artos or a relational word, may be better heard in a live tradition as lak or lakak, not merely physical food, but the sustenance that nourishes understanding and communion, the bread that feeds the heart's perception. Asking for daily lak is not only a request for meals, but a plea for the measure of understanding sufficient for the living moment. Similarly, the word for debts or trespasses opens into a broader field when heard through ancient tongues. Koba or chova can indicate obligations, entanglements, debts that anchor you to patterns and relationships that require restoration. To ask for the loosening of debts is to request a new alignment, to be untied from the knots that keep the spirit bound. And then there is a word that appears in some of the Aramaic-rooted readings as bisha, a term that gestures toward disorder, a misalignment in the heart or life. To be delivered from bisha is to seek a realignment into the created order, where the heart's rhythm matches the source's rhythm. Read in this key, the prayer's petitions form a descent. Invoke the source. Ask for provision of understanding and strength. Ask for loosening of knots and protection from disorientation. Many liturgical versions then close with phrases that emphasize God's dominion, for thine is the kingdom, which situates God's rule outward as a realm to which we look. That ending, familiar and reverent, is also interpretively powerful. It can implicitly preserve a gulf between the sovereign God out there and the person in here. Several manuscript traditions include such doxologies as liturgical additions. Some scholars believe these lines were later liturgical appendices, pious additions used in worship, not necessarily original to Jesus' teaching. We should say this carefully. Manuscripts vary, and the presence of doxological endings in later texts does not mean they are malicious insertions. They reflect centuries of worship practices, reverence, and theological emphasis. But when you are practicing prayer as a technology, a trained movement of body, attention, and breath, a doxology that leaves the voice hanging outwards can feel unfinished. The old monastic manuals teach the soul to receive presence inwardly, to allow the movement of prayer to culminate in an embodied remembrance, not merely thine is the kingdom in the abstract, but a closure that names God's presence as breathing within the supplicant. In other words, instead of concluding by asserting God's dominion from a distance, the prayer could have closed by restoring the presence of spirit and light into the living vessel that had spoken. Here, the Nag Hammadi texts are suggestive, not decisive. Within those codices and in the Gospel of Thomas, a sayings collection that reads like a field manual for recognition, there are recurrent motifs, light as an inner reality, knowing as awakening, and the movement from outer petition to inward reception. A certain strand of sayings insists that the kingdom is not a distant polity, but a discovery of a present reality. The kingdom is within. This phrase, famously recorded in canonical Luke, is echoed by other traditions that emphasize discovery over future promise. Taken together, the witnesses suggest an early Christianity in which liturgical forms and contemplative practices coexisted, each reinterpreting the other.
So suppose, as a plausible reconstruction proposes, that a closing line once existed to complete the circuit, a sentence meant to move the recognized source back into the body of the prayer, to make the prayer not only a petition, but a vehicle of remembering. The hypothesis is not a forensic certainty. It is a theological and liturgical reading grounded in comparative manuscripts, Aramaic sensibilities, and the practices of prayerful communities. Treated as a possibility strong enough to experiment with, humble enough to be revised, and reverent enough to sit alongside canonical forms. If we listen for words that could have played this return function, two Aramaic-rooted terms are especially compelling, ruka and nahuda. Ruka, related to breath and spirit, names the animating wind that moves through the chest. Philosophically, to speak of ruka is to name the medium by which life animates form, the sacred breath. Nahuda, often translated as light, evokes a luminous consciousness, a clarity that shines and reveals. When combined in ritual language, ruka and nahuda suggest not just two attributes of God, but a composite presence, breath that is light, light that is breathing, and interior brightening. Now hear this as a hypothesis. What if the prayer's missing closure returned the invoked Shemaya and the invoked source not as an external governance, but as inside breath and inner light? A reconstruction offered by some interpreters, and I will be careful in how I present it, renders a possible closing as an invocation that allows the prayer to acknowledge inwardly that the spirit and the light are not only beyond but within. They are breathing through the one who prays. This is not an attempt to rewrite doctrine or to deny God's transcendence. It is simply a liturgical turn toward remembrance. The one who prays recognizes that the divine presence supports and animates them from the inside.
Remember, this is a reconstruction, a reading that coheres with certain manuscript tendencies and with the lived practices of desert contemplatives. Some manuscripts and some traditions reflect a theology of inner illumination. Others emphasize external soteriological narratives. Both are historically attested. We only suggest that there was once within the breadth of early Christian practice an impulse to close liturgical circuits, to make the prayer return to the body. The practical implication of such a closure is serious. It alters how you inhabit prayer. If the final line affirms that the Spirit and light breathe through you, then prayer is not merely petition, but a disciplined recollection of presence. That shifts identity. You cease being only a supplicant and begin to discover yourself as temple, as a locus where divine breath meets human vessel. The implications ripple outward. How do you relate to authority if your center is an interiorized access to presence? How do you attend to Scripture if you also have a tradition of embodied practices that cultivate recognition? These are not demands to abandon institutions or communal life. They are invitations to integrate. Before we try the language itself, I need to unpack two technical cautions. First, the Aramaic roots we cite are interpretive tools, etymological lenses, not airtight translations. Linguistic equivalencies are complex. One root can unfold into multiple synonyms, and the same word in Greek manuscripts can carry different shades of meaning depending on the scribe's theological aims. Second, the claim that an original final line was removed implies editorial processes that are complicated and often benign. Many early churches added liturgical lines in worship as doxologies. Scribes harmonized texts according to local usage. The phenomenon we observe is less a story of conspiracy than of evolving worship practices and editorial choices made under pressure, with reverence and with limitations. Yet when you sit quietly with the possibility, when you imagine the prayer's last syllables turning and coming back into your body like a tidal wave finding the shore, you can feel why this reconstruction matters to seekers. It converts a practice into a technology. Prayer becomes an engineered circuit of attention. The ancients trained the body as much as the mind. They taught posture, breath, and rhythm as companions of attention. Evagrius and his contemporaries were not concerned with scholastic hair-splitting. They wanted attention to be trained so that the heart could recognize what it already held. In that sense, the recovered line is less a doctrine than a lever, something that, when voiced and embodied, helps you remember. Let us attend now, line by line, to the prayer in its familiar arc, listening for places where the language invites the inward return. You begin by addressing Abun, the source, an immediate orienting to origin. The language is intimate, not abstract.
It is as if your first breath reaches back to the well that made breath possible. Then you name the realm, the Shemaya, which signals the openness from which life pours. Asking for daily lack, the sustenance for today, is a practice of dependency and trust, a daily calibration that keeps you poor enough to receive. Asking for respite from debts is a petition to be untied from the patterns that obscure sight. seeking deliverance from inclination towards disorder, is a request to be aligned. At this point, in many liturgical recitations, the voice pauses. We have asked, we have petitioned, and tradition then often pronounces God's sovereignty over things. That posture honors the Creator's reign, and yet it can leave the speaker in a posture of looking outward for rescue rather than discovering rescue already present. The reconstruction proposes an alternative ritual grammar. After petition, the prayer does not stop at the assertion of dominion. It closes by acknowledging the inward presence. Instead of leaving thine as a distant possession, it returns thine as a breathing within. If you accept that as a plausible liturgical move, the next step is linguistic, to offer a wording that names Ruka and Nahuda together, to make explicit that the spirit and the light are not merely beyond, but flowing through. The phrase that has been suggested in liturgical circles, in contemplative communities, and in some scholarly reconstructions frames this idea succinctly. It suggests that God's spirit and God's light are forever breathing through me. I offer that sentence not as a literal or archaeologically proven utterance of Jesus, but as a reconstruction that coheres with the Aramaic sensibilities and manuscript patterns we've surveyed. Now feel for a moment the theological contours of this line. To say, the Spirit and the light forever breathing through me, does three things at once. It affirms presence as dynamic, spirit equals breath. It affirms presence as revelatory, light equals revealing consciousness, and it locates that presence within the prayer's own organism. The word forever here functions liturgically to stabilize the identity. You are not a temporary vessel that may or may not host presence. You are habitually, constitutively permeated by this breath, light. Again, I speak as an interpreter, not as someone asserting textual certainty. The language holds a theological imagination that is ancient and extant in many mystical Christian expressions. There is also a pastoral edge to this recovery. If prayer can be taught as a technology of recollection, then spiritual formation becomes an apprenticeship in recognition. The Desert Fathers trained this by harnessing breath, posture, and attention. They would instruct a novice to cultivate a breathing rhythm that aligns with prayerful phrases, to rest the hand on the chest or belly so the body remembers. Their aim was not to manufacture sensations, but to remove obstacles to awareness.
In their witness, practice was about clear seeing. It was an exercise of reorientation toward a presence that is ever near. At this moment, a hesitation often appears in listeners. Does this mean the institutional church was wrong to emphasize God's transcendence? Not necessarily. The church has always held a tension between transcendence and immanence. The classical creeds affirm both. God is both beyond and within, sovereign and near. The reconstruction we are entertaining does not negate God's rule. It complements it by recovering an interior grammar of presence that was cultivated in certain early communities. Think of it not as an oppositional manifesto, but as a recovered strand within the tapestry of Christian practice. There is another important textual echo worth underscoring, the prayer of Jesus in John 17. In that remarkable chapter, he prays for unity and for those who will believe. He prays that the love that binds the Father and Son might be in them. The language is intimate, relational, and directed toward indwelling. That Johannine theology resonates with the idea that divine life is not only future hope, but present possibility to be realized within the believer. The Gospel of Thomas and the Nag Hammadi sayings may present this emphasis more starkly or differently, but together they remind us that early Christianities were not monolithic. A variety of emphases circulated, some of which made the interior experience of divine presence central. As we begin to bring these strands into a coherent practice, note the posture we are cultivating. Humility first. We do not press this reconstruction as proof. We say, rather, that the prayer's form suggests a design, the manuscripts add plausible witness, and the desert tradition offers a method. That triad, text, witness, practice, is the bedrock on which we will experiment. So far, we have surveyed the landscape, the Nag Hammadi discoveries, the Gospel of Thomas's sayings, the Desert Fathers' attentional training, and the Aramaic roots that give a different tonal coloring to familiar phrases. We have introduced the idea that an ending might have moved the prayer from an outward posture to an inward completion, and we have suggested a reconstructed phrasing that names Ruha and Nuhura as breath and light breathing through the one who prays. We have also set guardrails. This is a plausible reconstruction, not archaeology's verdict. It is an invitation, not a demand.
Now, before we move into the practice that would allow you to test this liturgical turn in your own body, I want to offer a close reading of two crucial moments in the prayer's middle ground, moments where the liturgy both evokes dependence and prepares the heart to receive the return. First, the plea for daily bread, understood here as a request for lack adequate to the day, is a training in poverty of spirit. It keeps you dependent, awake, and present.
If one were to habitually claim abundance in some abstract future, the heart could harden. Asking for the day's necessary lack trains attention to the immediate need and to the sufficiency of presence for the present moment. There is a spiritual economy here. Daily lack invites steady reception, which is the soil for remembrance. Second, the petition for forgiveness and for the forgiveness of others is not a private transaction, but a de-knotting. When the heart is entangled in grievances, attention is diverted outward toward injury and away from presence. The prayer's movement toward forgiving others is a training in loosening knots so that the pulse of breath light can move unimpeded. In the desert lexicon, purification of grudge is purification of attention. The practice of forgiving thus functions not merely as moral rectitude, but as a technique to clear channels of perception. If you followed this far, you are already recruited into a little experiment of attention. The intellectual outline invites you, the practices will test it. Before we step into the guided place, I want to share one more textual note that deepens the context. Some early liturgical manuscripts appended short doxologies to prayers as an act of praise used in corporate worship. These additions often affirmed God's rule forever. They were communal exclamations of devotion. What we are proposing differs in orientation from many of those doxologies. It is less about asserting God's rule beyond us and more about acknowledging God's indwelling rule through us. Both impulses are worshipful. The distinction is practical. One serves corporate proclamation, the other serves interior recollection. Both have their place. There is an ethical nuance too. Recovering a practice of interior remembrance should not breed spiritual isolation or arrogance. Those who cultivated inward prayer in the deserts often lived communally or in loose networks. Their practices were not escapes, but formations designed to bring people into deeper forms of love and action. To remember the breath light within is to be lit for service, not to withdraw. The recovery we are speaking of then aims at maturation. The more you learn to receive presence within, the more you are equipped to love and serve outwardly from that place. So where does that leave us now? We have mapped a possibility. We have gathered texts, traditions, and linguistic keys that make the idea coherent. We have proposed a reconstructed phrase that names spirit and light as breathing through the prayer. We have taken care to qualify our claims and to respect the diversity of Christian witness. The time left is to translate this into embodied practice, to place hands on chest and belly, to let breath and phrase interlock, to allow the words to do their work on attention. Before I guide you into that embodied experiment, take a moment to notice your current posture. Where is your chest?
Is your breath shallow near the throat or resting lower in the torso? Are your shoulders tight? Prayer as technology begins with these simple perceptions. The texts we have surveyed cared for the body as a vehicle for attention. They did not scorn flesh, but sanctified it. When we do the practice, we will use the traditional prayer as the descent, the asking, and then offer the reconstructed line as the return. But for now, hold the phrase tenderly in your mind, spirit and light breathing through you. Let it float without forcing it into belief or skepticism. Allow it to register as a resonant image. Whether you swallow it whole, chew on it slowly, or reject it outright, the image will have done its job if it surfaces some interior sensation, a softening in the chest, a quickened awareness, a flicker of longing. There is one more scholarly caution to offer before we cross into the practice, for the sake of intellectual integrity. Manuscript evidence is messy. The Nag Hammadi codices are late relative to the earliest papyri we possess, and the Gospel of Thomas exists in multiple Greek and Coptic forms with variant readings. Linguistic reconstruction from Aramaic roots is an art of probability, not certainty. In other words, we are assembling a mosaic from shards drawn from different contexts and centuries. The reconstruction stands as a hypothesis grounded in patterns, not a sealed fact. Nevertheless, the pattern matters because practices follow patterns. Communities that lost certain ritual forms sometimes retained practices in other registers.
in gestures, in breathing techniques, in passing phrases. The Desert Fathers, for example, preserved ways of centering that likely coexisted with liturgical forms that later became dominant in institutional worship. Those practices survived in the margins and in the bodies of those whose primary occupation was to stay awake and attentive. So here is the immediate invitation. Keep listening. We will soon move from explanation to enactment. The practice will be simple and inclusive. You may do it silently or aloud. You may stand, sit, or lie down. It will not require you to abandon the forms you already love. Rather, it will allow you to feel, in a controlled and reverent way, what the reconstructed closing might do to the experience of prayer. But before we begin the guided practice, I want to close this preparatory arc with a short, humble invocation, an orientation rather than an incantation, addressed to the Source in the language of longing and allowance. Father, or Source, whose life precedes every breath, we come now as learners and as ones who have been taught. Keep us humble, keep us curious. Let no discovery make us forget the central commands of love you have given us. Let any word we try on be a tool for mercy and for service. If anything in our speculation hardens our hearts, undo it. If anything opens us toward more faithful love, preserve it.
In this posture of petition and readiness, we will attempt together a small ritual of return, a practiced breath, an offered phrase, a listening for presence. When you are ready, soften your shoulders and place one hand lightly on your chest and the other on your belly. Feel the weight of your hands as a small anchor. Allow your eyes to rest softly, or close them if that helps. This is not a requirement. Some of you will remain fully awake and watchful, and that is enough. Begin to notice breath without forcing it. Let it be the body's wise self-regulation. If you feel lightheaded or uncomfortable at any time, return to your ordinary breathing. This is not a technique for altering chemistry. It is a way of aligning attention. Hold the traditional words in your imagination now, not necessarily to recite them verbatim, but to trace their motion as a movement, from calling the Source, through asking for daily sustenance and forgiveness, seeking orientation and protection. Feel that descent happen as you watch the breath follow the line of your intention. And then, when the petition has softened, open yourself to the reconstructed return, the possibility that the Spirit and the light are not merely attributes of God out beyond you, but are breathing here, through you. Let those words, Ruka and Nahura, Spirit and light, be not merely concepts, but soft focal points for attention. Notice whether naming them changes the quality of the breath in your chest. Notice whether a sense of interior presence seems more available, not because someone promised it would be, but because your attention has been invited to a location where presence might already be dwelling. Hold that awareness for a few breaths. Let the image of breath light comb your being like a gentle wind carrying light. Breathe and receive. Allow yourself to be a vessel, not as a theological claim to superiority, but as a humble recognition of your createdness, a body made to host breath and light. You may feel nothing dramatic, or you may feel a subtle shift. Either is normal. The point is not to manufacture an experience, but to train attention. The ancients knew that one practice done steadily over years can rewire the patterns of habit. As you sit with this, a question will likely arise in you. What does such an inner claim do to the way we live outwardly? Does it make us spiritually self-sufficient? Does it erode the need for community and accountability? These are real concerns, and they require careful pastoral framing. The Desert Fathers themselves were embedded in communities. Their solitude was often a means of formation for service. When the heart is anchored to presence, it tends to expand toward compassion rather than contract into isolation. You may also ask whether asserting that God breathes through you collapses the distance between creator and created.
It does not, in classical theology, remove divine transcendence. Rather, it affirms an ancient paradox. God is both wholly other and intimately near. The recovered line emphasizes the near without denying the other. I will pause here in the words and the posture, because the practice that follows needs to be approached with care, and because we must keep open room for further exploration, philological, historical, and spiritual.
There are more fragments to examine, more desert teachings to consult, and more linguistic subtleties to tease apart. The restoration I present is a possibility among possibilities. It is, however, an invitation that has borne fruit for many seekers in the contemplative condition, a way to let prayer be not simply a plea, but a remembrance turned inward. Stay with that invitation for a moment. Let the image of breath and light moving through your chest sit like a question on the tongue. True? Possible? Worth trying? When you are ready, we will move from speculation into practice, using the traditional movement as the descent and the reconstructed phrase as the return. We will test it gently, with the care of a community that honors history and also the living presence of God in the human vessel. But before we take that step, there is one final thing to say in this section. To understand the significance of retrieving a closing line is to see prayer not as an isolated ritual, but as a formational technology. That means it trains something: attention, identity, memory. The line we have proposed functions as a mnemonic device. It is a liturgical nudge that encourages the prayer to remember the indwelling breath light. The spiritual life in this view is less about accumulating correct propositions and more about relearning how to allow the body to host the source it invokes. Now gather yourself once more, not in haste but with a deliberate readiness. The next movement is to speak, to breathe, and to allow the reconstructed return to be spoken after the descent. As you do, keep the scholarly caution in one hand and the pastoral humility in the other. This practice is an experiment in remembrance. Its authority rests not on documents alone, but on the convergence of ancient patterns and the readiness of the heart to receive. Let the memory of the desert and the whisper of the manuscripts guide you, but let charity shape every interpretation. Let curiosity lead, not triumphalism. And when you finally speak the reconstructed line, do so as one who is receiving a gift, not seizing a treasure. Keep your hands where they rest. Feel the slow motion of breath. When you are prepared to try the full sequence, descent and return, join me in the next moment, and we will voice the familiar words and then the restored closing together, tenderly, mindfully, and without expectation of guaranteed results.
When you are prepared to try the full sequence, descent and return, speak gently, as if lowering a cup to drink from a deep well you have only glimpsed. Keep your hands where they rest. Keep the postures soft. We will move together slowly. First the descent of petition, then the restored return that names the inward presence. Begin by feeling the breath where it is already moving. Trace its path with attention, through the nose, into the chest, down into the belly. Let the breath simply be what it is. Do not force it. Allow each phrase you will speak to have the same economy as breath, short enough to be inhabitable, long enough to carry sense. If you are comfortable, say or hold in your mind the prayer you know as the Lord's Prayer, letting its motion be the descent we described, the call to source, the asking for sustenance for the day, the unbinding from debts, the plea for right orientation. You may recite it aloud or silently. Either is valid. Speak it in the voice that most naturally fits your practice. If you prefer a familiar liturgical cadence, use that. If you prefer your own paraphrase, that too will do. What matters is the movement, not the performance. When the petitions have been voiced, prepare the body for return. Soften the jaw, let the shoulders fall. Rest your fingertips lightly on the breastbone and the belly. Imagine the prayer's arc leaning back toward you, like a river finding its inland channel. Now, with humility and care, receive the reconstructed return as an offered liturgical possibility, a sentence some communities and interpreters have used as a way to close the circuit. I offer it here as reconstruction, not as an archaeological verdict. The wording that many contemplative practitioners have found helpful goes like this: "For yours is the spirit and the light, forever breathing through me." Say those words gently, aloud if that is safe and comfortable for you, or silently if you prefer. Let each syllable find the place in the chest where breath meets attention. When you say spirit, feel the air that animates the shape of the word. When you say light, allow an image of warmth or clarity to move behind the eyes. The phrase "forever breathing through me" is not a boast, it is a mnemonic, a liturgical nudge toward remembering that the life you invoke is also the life that inhabits you. After you voice the reconstructed line, do not rush to evaluate. Allow your awareness to linger where the words have landed. Notice any subtle changes in the breath's depth,
or in the sensation behind the sternum. Notice whether your attention feels more gathered, more inward, or whether nothing much seems to change at all. All responses are legitimate. This practice is about training attention, not manufacturing mystical effects. If an emotion arises, a thawing, a grief, relief, resistance, receive it without judgment. The desert teachers taught that feelings are like weather. They pass through.
What matters is steadiness of attention. If you feel disoriented or uneasy, simply return to a neutral awareness of the breath and the weight of your hands. If at any point you feel faint or uncomfortable, ease out of the posture and resume ordinary breathing. Do this simple sequence again if you wish, the descent of the titians followed by the restored phrase. Try it as a single breath sentence, letting the inhalation carry the descent and the exhalation host the return. Or let the descent be a series of brief petitions and the return a single, slow acceptance. The form is less important than the fidelity of attention. Practiced over days and weeks, this little liturgical loop functions like a muscle. Its repetition trains the circulatory path of prayer. Call outward, receive inward. The ancients understood that habits of posture and breath shape the horizon of what you notice. Practicing in this way cultivates an interior grammar in which presence is not merely a doctrinal assertion, but an enacted recognition. The one who prays remembers that they are a living place. Now let us consider how to integrate this into ordinary life without making hyperbolic claims. There are pastoral boundaries worth naming plainly. First, this practice does not grant magical immunity from harm, automatic supernatural results, or a bypass of moral responsibility. It trains attention and can reorient identity, but it does not replace medicine, counseling, or the wise guidance of trustworthy companions. Second, this reconstruction is a theological and liturgical proposal. Some communities will embrace it, others will prefer established doxologies and liturgical texts that emphasize God's transcendence. Both orientations can cohere within a mature faith. The recovery we practice is an addition to, not a subtraction from, the sacramental and communal life of the Church. What might faithful integration look like? Here are a few modest, practical pathways you can consider, each offered as suggestion rather than prescription. Use one, combine several, or improvise according to your context. Morning and evening centering. Begin the day with the descent and return loop as a way of tuning attention. End the day with it as a regathering. Even 3 repetitions can recalibrate a harried mind toward steadiness. Before scripture or sacrament, use the loop to prepare your body before reading holy texts or participating in an act of worship. Let the inward recognition make you an interiorly prepared lens for what you receive. Momentary recollection. In times of stress, place a hand on the chest and voice the short phrase inwardly, "Spirit and light breathing through me." Use it like a breath anchor, not a talisman. Communal practice. Bring this loop into a small prayer group or study circle. Practice together, and then sit in silence to share impressions. The desert tradition was communal as much as solitary. Practices belong in both registers.
Ethical commissioning. Allow the inward presence to fuel outward action. When you affirm that life breathes through you, let that recognition lead to acts of service, compassion, and accountability. Presence is not privatized spirituality. It is the ground for sacrificial love. Consider what oversight or companionship you might want as you adopt such a practice. Seek mentors who practice contemplative disciplines responsibly, people with experience and with pastoral sensitivity, and who can help interpret interior experiences without sensationalism. The Desert Fathers were guided by elders. Modern recoveries benefit from similar accountability. It is important, too, to hold historical humility in one hand while practicing in the other. Some manuscripts and sayings collections place greater attention on the theme of inner illumination. Others emphasize communal proclamation and future eschatology. The reconstruction we use draws on a cluster of affinities: Aramaic resonances, Nag Hammadi sayings, the Gospel of Thomas's emphasis on discovery, and the desert tradition's focus on breath and attention. Taken together, they create a pattern worth trying, but patterns are not proofs. Be ready to revise your language as scholarship and tradition continue to speak. People sometimes worry, does reclaiming an interior grammar of prayer weaken the Church's liturgical authority? It need not. Think instead of liturgical plurality. The ancient Church always contained variations of practice: catechesis, Eucharistic rites, monastic offices, and local prayers.
Recoveries like this one aim to restore a dimension of practice that once existed alongside other practices. When recovered with humility, they enrich the liturgical ecosystem rather than destabilize it. There are also pastoral safeguards to hold in community. Avoid using inner experiences to claim spiritual superiority, and create opportunities for mutual discernment. If someone reports overwhelming mystical phenomena, treat it with gentle curiosity and pastoral care. The purpose of these practices is formation toward humility and love, not self-aggrandizement. If you are a leader or a teacher, consider how to shepherd others toward this practice responsibly. Offer clear instructions. It is optional, experimentally framed, historically suggestive. Provide context where persons can share their experiences safely. Encourage grounding practices, sleep, diet, social support, and when needed, professional help. Now return for a moment to the larger theological horizon. The recovered line, "For yours is the Spirit and the light forever breathing through me," invites you into a paradox central to Christian faith. God's transcendence and immanence are not mutually exclusive, but mutually illuminating. John 17's prayer, which asks that the love that binds Father and Son might be in those who believe, is a canonical echo of the same impulse. The Gospel of Thomas and some Nag Hammadi texts press this emphasis in other idioms: knowledge as remembrance, light as discovering what is already present. To retrieve a liturgical sentence that names indwelling is to join an existing stream in the river of Christian thought, a stream that has alternately receded and resurged through centuries. Practically, if you adopt this loop as a practice, expect it to be a long-term apprenticeship rather than a quick fix. The desert teachers insisted on patient repetition. They did not promise immediate illumination. Instead, they promised formation, that repeated orientation toward presence would gradually refine attention, widen compassion, and steady the heart under pressure. If you are curious to go deeper, to read the relevant manuscripts, explore linguistic reconstructions, or join a guided group for practice, I have gathered a few resources that may help. There is a curated packet of primary texts and translations, a short bibliography of introductory scholarship on Nag Hammadi and the Gospel of Thomas, and a small study guide for practicing the descent and return loop with a group. You can find these materials in the description and the pinned comment beneath this video. They are offered as tools for study and practice, not as an endorsement of any single doctrine. If you are interested in ongoing community practice, there is a modest private group linked there as well, a space for seekers to practice together with mutual support and accountability. Before we close, let us anchor with one brief moment of prayer, a short invocation that holds caution and longing together. I will address it as prayer to the source, following the rules of our practice, brief, humble, and oriented toward transformation rather than guarantee. Father, source of breath and light, keep us humble as we explore. Let any recovery of word or practice lead us to more faithful love. If what we say opens our hearts to neighbor, bless it. If it hardens our pride, unmake it. Teach us to carry presence into service. Amen. As you leave this practice, take with you 3 modest commitments to test whether this recovery bears practical fruit in your life. First, practice the descent and return 3 times a day for a week and note any shifts in attention or compassion. Second, name one small act of service that your recollection of presence can prompt this week. Third, bring your questions and experiences to a trusted companion for reflection. We began with a question. Might the prayer you were taught once have included a closing that completed its circuit? We surveyed manuscripts, languages, and monastic practices, and we tried a reconstruction as a lived experiment. You have now practiced receiving, and your response, skeptical, moved, or indifferent, is part of the experiment's data. The point is not to coerce belief, but to cultivate remembrance.
This invitation is an offering, an ancient-shaped practice adapted for our moment. Use it with discernment. If it deepens your love for God and neighbor, let it continue. If it unsettles you in ways that drain rather than empower, set it aside and seek guidance. Faithful practice always lives under the governance of charity. If this exploration has resonated, you are welcome to download the Sacred Scrolls packet, read the short bibliographic notes provided, or join the small practice group linked in the description and pinned comment. Those resources are meant to help you investigate responsibly and practice sustainably. May you go from here with a steadying breath and a soft awareness of light. May the practice of prayer be for you a teacher that calls you outward towards justice and inward towards humility. You are a vessel made to receive and to give. May that mystery shape you towards mercy. You are whole. You are holy. You are home.